Good morning, welcome bright and early to today's edition of The Breakfast Club. My name's Toya Singh, and right here on the show we're actually taking a look at a really interesting topic today. AI is the talk of the town. It's been the talk of the town for a while now. But how are younger people using it? And more interestingly, how are young people in India using it? This is the first ever study that actually looks at how young Indians are using different kinds of AI, what they're using it for, and the results are super interesting. We're taking a look right here on the show. After that, Kritsween, what are we looking at?
After that, we're going to talk about someone who was inspired by his childhood, and he created something for the entire country out of that one thought for his own son. And this was the very interesting thought of a natural swimming pool. So it's got no chlorine. It's very, very healthy for your children. And we'll talk about his journey so far and how it's moved to other parts of the world as well. A quick check of everything we've got covered for you over the next 1 hour. We start with AI as young India's midnight confidant, companionship therapy now through AI. All of this is happening. There is a study that we're going to decode here with someone who was the person behind this study, and the study is called Are You There AI? Half of young India studies with AI, but there's lots more that they use this tech for.
And we take a look at wild swimming pools. What are they? Well, they're built with stream water, biospheres that bring nature into our backyard. And we wanted to look at this because we wanted you to have a positive example of how one person can build something very cool and what you have to learn from it for your own backyard.
And then we move on to decoding Volvo EX30 and its driving experience. It's a compact luxury EV. The review this morning on The Breakfast Club. Well, for many of us, AI still feels like something distant, a buzzword in headlines, or a tool we've heard about but never actually tried.
But you might remember a few months ago, Harvard Business Review revealed that among the top 10 uses of generative AI, number one was therapy and companionship. People were turning, for example, to ChatGPT and saying, help me figure out this personal problem. Now, even then it was clear that technology wasn't about tasks. It was already being used for trust.
And if that was the global picture, what about India? We're going to talk about the India-specific story. For young Indians, AI has already slipped into the everyday. It's not just powering search results or homework help. It's becoming a confidant, a midnight therapist, even a mirror for loneliness.
Now, a new Youth Pulse study conducted by Youth Ki Awaaz and Young Leaders for Active Citizenship, or YLAC, puts numbers to that change. And these are striking numbers that their study has brought in. More than half of young digital Indians use AI as a study partner. Nearly 4 in 10 have confided something to a chatbot that they wouldn't tell another person. And a third are even turning to AI for advice to shift their negative thinking.
That makes AI companionship mainstream, not a niche experiment. Young people are rehearsing tough conversations. They're testing breakup texts and finding calm during lonely hours, all with a tool that never sleeps, never interrupts, and never judges.
But it also raises harder questions, obviously. What AI says it understands. When AI says it's understanding an emotion, for example, is it really reading us, or is it flattening complex feelings into neat categories? What happens to privacy when our most vulnerable moments are shared with an algorithm? And what does trust mean when the listener isn't human?
The verdict, according to this study, is nuanced. Humans remain essential, but emotional support no longer waits for human presence.
Now, this morning on The Breakfast Club, we unpack Are You There AI? It's India's first deep dive into how young people are using tech, not just for tasks, but also for trust. Let's go over to both our guests. We'll introduce both of them to you. Anshul Tiwari, founder of He's the CEO of Youth Ki Awaaz. It's India's largest citizen media and polling platform. We're also joined by Natasha. She's the Chief Strategy Officer of the Rohini Neelkani Philanthropies. And among other things, this philanthropy therapy supports mental health initiatives, and we'll be talking a little bit about exactly how they do that. So we're going to go over to both of them to ask them more. Anshul, we're going to come over to you first and just ask you a few questions about how this study was conducted. So just break down for us first, what was the sample size? Just tell us the technicalities. What was the sample size and how was the study conducted exactly? How did you bring about a representative group so that we can actually say this is how the youth of India is using AI?
Sure. No, thank you so much for that question. I'm glad you asked because, I mean, the first thing that comes up with a lot of these studies is that how representative is it really? So I do want to clarify that this is a pilot study. It's a dipstick. So what it does is it tells us a very strongly upcoming trend. The sample size that we had about 3,000 people who took the survey, but out of those 3,000, we qualified about 568 responses that we felt represented a young India that uses AI tools, that is already digitally native, that is very active online, and that is in some way or the other already having conversations with AI tools. Within that sample size, we were able to use a method that we call raking or weighing, which basically means that whatever is the population scale government official study that was conducted, in our case that's the last census, we weigh the representation of the sample that we have against the census. So what that means is, if according to the census the population is underrepresented, we make sure that in our sample that's the ratio that we use when we measure, when we do the statistical analysis as well, and we also take in an error of margin. So when we say that this is representative, it is fairly representative, but I must say that except for the government of India, nobody can truly do a population representative study in the country, because nobody has access to every single person in the country. But yes, this comes to a very high degree of accuracy when it comes to what young India is really feeling and going through on this subject.
Okay.
The numbers were very interesting. When we went through the numbers in itself, it was so interesting how heavily dependent the young India is on AI. But for several needs, it's not just limited to education, it's limited to emotional needs too. Anshul, can I just ask you, before you decode that entire story and numerically what it means for young India, tell us a couple of things that took you by surprise, things that left you a little worried that, oh, is this the direction that we're headed?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think firstly, I'll talk about where the study even came from. We work a lot with young people, and on our platform, we see stories by young people, especially very personal stories on their relationships, how they're dealing with their, relationship with their parents in many cases, how they're sort of, seeing their friendships evolve and so on. And we noticed an emerging trend in hundreds of these narratives that people were very actively talking about how they're taking to AI tools to confide in those tools, to articulate themselves better, to often even manage their relationships better. A lot of the in-person consultations that we've organized with teenagers, we've had teenagers come to us and confess that, when my parent is scolding me, I talk to an AI tool to calm myself down, to have a rational conversation about what's really going on in my household. Oftentimes, I feel like the AI tool is able to understand me better than my partner, and that sort of rang alarm bells in our mind. We really wanted to decode this and understand this a lot better. So what we tried to do with this particular study is we wanted to understand whether young India is developing emotional dependence of any kind on AI chatbots and AI tools. And that's exactly what this study proves. We already see in this study itself that many young people, 88% of the people who took this study, are using tools like ChatGPT and various others to handle their anxiety and stress. They're already using it almost like a therapist. In fact, I must also point to one very real lived experience that we saw in one of our consultations that we did, where a group of 30 teenagers who actually take therapy offline told us that AI tools often give them better advice than their therapist. Now that's, again, it raises many alarm bells in terms of where reliability, dependency of a lot of these tools stands at, how much trust are we, to sort of lay on these tools, and how much is it okay to confide in these tools about your personal life, about various other aspects of your life, right? And what we're seeing is the younger the person, so this study looks at 13 to 18, but if you see 13 to 14, 15, the level of trusts are much higher. So now noticing that younger people who are sort of being born in an era where AI is the norm, they're finding higher resonance in a tool that affords them the agency that maybe in the real world they're struggling to find. Okay. So I think it raises many questions and many sort of doubts about these tools as well.
Okay, so you've touched on a really fascinating thing. Let's go over to Natasha to ask her more. Natasha, your organization does a lot of work. In fact, one article described it as you having donated, your organization having donated a landmark amount of money to different mental health initiatives across the country. I want to understand, in your own work, what have you discovered about teenagers in particular? About the young teenage brain, for example. There are a lot of parents watching this today. Natasha, I'm going to ask you this first and then we'll come over to you to ask you this, Anshul, too. Like, what are the good news, if there's any good news in this study, what is it? So, Natasha, first to you. I think you're on mute, so we're not being able to hear you.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's a really great question because if you look at the World Health Organization, it designates 10 to 19 as adolescence, as a period. And the reason to designate that as a specific stage of life is because it is very particular. And even from our work in mental health, what we have found, for instance, and this is not to alarm anyone, but like a majority of mental disorders show up in that age group. And what that basically means is that you have this brain that is wiring, growing, developing very rapidly. It is going through many changes. Your body is going through many changes, and as a result, when you are an adolescent, how you are interacting with your social world, your physical world becomes very, very important. I mean, so I think that the main point to land here is that whatever it is, whether it is the kinds of physical lives that teenagers are living or the digital lives they're living, both need to be looked at really carefully. And in this case, I think because, to Anshul's point, that we don't know enough. We just simply don't know enough about what interactions, firstly, what are they? I mean, what is the nature of these interactions?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are many other attendant risks. So when we're looking at the risks versus, the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns, when we take all of that into account and then you take this very critical age group, I think we have to be a little bit more careful when we're treading.
I also want to ask Anshul, because when you go through the study in detail, you see how he and his entire team has very carefully spoken of the gender perspective and the age perspective. Both of these perspectives have been highlighted in this report. So take it from there, Anshul, and tell us a little bit about what you made of the pattern, for instance, on how up until post-graduation, for instance, the young Indians are heavily dependent on AI or artificial intelligence, this entire technology, for emotional support. It's only post that when they actually get into their job domain or that phase of life is when they start using it for other purposes. Why is that happening?
Yeah. No, I think firstly, I'm glad you mentioned the gender part, because I feel like more than it being a problem of the tool, it really highlights where we are at as a society. How many spaces do really exist for young girls, for example, to openly have conversations about various issues that they might be dealing with, and why an AI tool might become a confidant in the situation where there is a severe lack of these spaces in our society in general. The second thing I do want to highlight is that more than AI being the problem here, and we've tried to say this again and again, I think it really talks about where we're at as a society. How do we really think of younger people? What does it mean to afford a teenager their agency, right? Oftentimes we approach teens from the point of view that we know more, we want to control their lives in a certain way. Where does a teenager we must also understand that this is a person who's on social media. They have too much information flowing their way in general, right? You're on an Instagram, you're on another platform. There's too much that you're consuming. There are too many opinions that you're, forming. There are too many things that you want to say, that you want to really express. But where do you go? Yeah. Especially if you're again and again told that you're young and your opinion doesn't matter, your experience doesn't count, and so on. Obviously, it's bound to happen that people will look for alternative spaces, and that's what we're really seeing with AI emerging as one of those alternative spaces. Right. The second thing is that it's not one tool against the other. What we're seeing is that very often many users also don't realize how deep in their AI usage they really are. They start with something small help, small sort of a tool that they might need help with, small doubt that they might want to resolve, and slowly and steadily they're asking questions that go a lot more personal, right? It goes from asking about their body image issues to say going much deeper than that, asking about their relationships and so on and so forth. So I think the reason why we wanted to specifically highlight the gender pattern was because it clearly showcases where as a society we really stand, right, when it comes to younger girls, young women, and so on and so forth. I think the other thing that we've noticed is across the age groups, right? So we qualified this study in broadly 3 age groups: 13 to 18, 19 to 25, and 26 to 30. What we really noticed was that 13 to 18 and 19 to 25 were the spaces where a person needs that support the most, because we noticed that as a person is growing older, their social circle is evolving. They're maybe creating more emotionally stable relationships in some cases. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case across the board, but at least in our study what we noticed was that emotional sharing dropped as people grew older, and that also indicates to one of the things that we noticed in our study, which was that nearly 67% of the people are actually worried about social isolation. They are worried that relying on social media, relying on AI tools might isolate them a lot more. And I think that thinking is evolving as they're growing older, and they're reaching a point where they feel like, okay, maybe this is not the only thing I need to depend on, or this is not the only thing that is sort of the place that I need to go to find my to find resonance. So I feel the pattern really exists on those fronts and really showcases where we're at socially as well.
Okay, so you brought up a point, and no, Natasha, I'll come to you on exactly that. So I know you were coming in, and I want to ask you. He brought up this idea of agency, and the fact that you have to treat young teens like they have agency. And I just want to ask you, if you were a parent, because a lot of the audience watching us right now, they are young parents. They have their own kids. How would you go about, because the discussion on social media is almost an overdone one, when would you let your kid use Instagram, for example? But let me ask you, Natasha, if you were a parent, how would you go about brainstorming with your child what AI, ChatGPT, Perplexity, guardrails would look like?
Yeah, so I am a parent.
Okay, yeah.
I have a 9-year-old son, and this is actually a conversation we have had, which is also, who is more creative, the human being or AI, and whether he should use it for his essays or not. So I think, there are a few questions here. Like, I think the thing what I wanted to come in on what Anshul was saying, one of the ways to understand the data is, because this is not a longitudinal study, we don't know whether these 13-year-olds will then become less dependent when they're 28. What we know is the ones who are today about 26 are not as dependent on AI, because that's not the native environment they grew up with. So that's one question mark. We don't actually know what will happen to the ones who are, being incubated in this environment. And I think that is a concern which me and many other parents, all of us have, which is, what is this doing to the wiring of our children? How are their brains fundamentally getting altered? To what extent is it happening? And because even the science is unclear, and a lot of it is resting on anecdote, it's resting on personal values, and it's a very confusing time, I think, for parents as well. So the thing that we advocate for, even at the foundation, for working with young people, agency for sure, but it's also, you have to have these multi-generational spaces where you can foster better communication between parents and children. So even on AI, for instance, should you not let your child use AI, or should you inform them about it? Should you know to what extent they're using it? And should this be like a healthy conversation and a two-way dialogue all the time, which is, non-judgmental? So all of the things that the teenagers are valuing in the AI, to what extent can parents also start creating that environment, right? Can you be a non-judgmental, safe space for your children? Can you give them can you be available to them? Because that's another problem that a lot of parents today are also, and this is across like tier 2, tier 3, across income classes. It's not just an elite issue, but even in very low income households, in fact more so there, because the parents are both dual income, they're out of the house. We have seen this in other studies that have been done as well in India, where children are particularly vulnerable because there's complete absenteeism in terms of parental attention, and that's also because a lot of parents right now are still not necessarily aware. Right now, there is still this perception that as long as वो बच्चा घर पे है, they're fine. Now, know is that वो घर पे क्या कर रहा है? That's really important, and that's a question that parents are not asking, because they're like, okay, my kid is at home and I'm going out to work. and my children are fine. So I think these conversations have to be triggered in society now and not just be limited to academic and, let's say, development sector spaces.
Speaking of society, I want Natasha, you to come in on what was highlighted by Anshul in his previous answer as well, which was gender-wise what more needs to be done. How can this kind of mental wellness be made more accessible so that people are not instantly opting for AI, for instance? But Anshul, before that, to once again highlight that question that Toya had put out, which is, are there any positives to take back home from this study? For all those parents who are really freaking out as we decode this story, anything positive you've picked up, a positive backgrounder to the entire study? Tell us more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just want to double down on one point that Natasha mentioned. I grew up in a time when social media was just coming in. And at that time, the conversation was that social media is bad for teens. But as I grew up in that era, I realized that I am taking to it more and more and more. And today I am on social media. I'm very natively present on social media. Everything I do, the organization I run is very social media dependent as well. And I feel that does highlight the fact that somebody who's 13, 14 today and is using AI, it's true, it's not a longitudinal study. We will have to probably study this every couple of years to really understand whether somebody who started at 13 eventually lowered their dependency or not. And I don't want to scare people, but there is a chance that they may not, because it does build a certain degree of reliance on a particular tool. Now coming to the positives, I think there is one thing that the study definitely highlights, which is that a majority of the users, 67% of the users, do self-report that they're afraid about the social isolation that they may face. They're worried about privacy risks, which basically means that, and they're also, worried about misuse of their personal data. So what it really does is it gives us an opportunity to figure out what could be an alternative intervention which people could use that does not create social isolation, that does not, create privacy risks for them, that does not misuse their personal data. And that's where the real opportunity for us actually lies. A lot of people are building tools, they're building technologies to be able to deal with this better. They're building avenues for people to be able to, confide in better, therapists and so on and so forth better. But of course, there is no clear solution to this, but there is a very clear indication that the users themselves are aware of the fact that this may lead to more social isolation. So that itself is a good indication that we're not dealing with a population that is completely tuned out of reality. They are very aware of what this is doing to them as well.
Okay, let's go back then to Natasha to ask her. Natasha, Kritsween kind of teased this question with you. What do you think gender-sensitive AI, building gender-sensitive AI would actually look like? And let me just ask you, I know that, on X, for example, a lot of people complaining that there's an inbuilt bias in ChatGPT, for example, and some interesting complaints. So you had, for example, a user comparing that if you told ChatGPT, I've cheated on my wife, versus you told it, I've cheated on my husband, ChatGPT would actually be more empathetic if it thought you were a woman. And I'm obviously not seconding any of those findings. You can often not verify these things, but I want to ask you that concept of bias, how do you tackle it? How do you feel through it?
It's a very complicated question because I think it's in the fundamental design of the LLM and the technology, right? So where is it getting its data from? And as long as the input data has bias in it, which it does, the outputs will continue to be biased. I think the question, though, there is an interesting question in this gender finding that the YK and YLAC study has thrown up, which is this difference between girls and boys. And because, one of our portfolios is on gender and it's on masculinities. So we really work with boys and look at their lives and, what are they up to? I think there is something there. It's worth inquiring in that, one is the technology, but two, the genders are different in terms of their socialization for sure. Their stages of development and maturity, and so you are finding you have this finding which is almost secular. You will find this globally. It's not just in India where, let's say, gender norms are very restricted, but even in economies and societies where gender norms are freer, you still find that girls have a greater disposition towards relational topics and sort of like the relationality of the technology, which is also why even with social media the effects on girls and boys are different, right? I think that is the question that needs continuous interrogation, which is that how is this feature then sort of amplifying in some ways perhaps the harms for girls more disproportionately than for boys in some ways.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? What are the ways in which you can already see it amplifying the difference for women versus men?
Well, I mean, on AI, of course, one is just like how they're interacting, what is their level of trust, but also in the kinds of responses they get. So, like you mentioned, I think there's also, even in technical domains, they get different responses. So, if you're a woman who's asking a question about, and the AI chatbot is aware of your identity, and let's say if you're a woman farmer, you're asking a question about how to get a loan, you might actually get a different answer, even on something like the government scheme. So, I think the whole point is about the fact that your gender is playing into every response you're getting.
Yeah.
But if you're not aware of that, and if you're not checking for that, you may get misled.
Natasha, you can start with this, and Anshul can then come in. I do want to ask the both of you all. We're living in times AI is not going to go away. We're going to have to learn how to coexist with technology, with artificial intelligence. And now, interestingly, you have startups which are looking at AI-driven mental wellness or well-being. How in this kind of a atmosphere then, or an ecosystem that we're going to find ourselves in, the young India is going to find itself in, do you deal with this challenge, Natasha?
So I do think that here there is a case which is for regulation and some amount of scrutiny. So like I think when you look at anything, there are industry standards, there are industry bodies. If you're putting out biscuits, there's FSSAI. So there are standards for very basic things. But when it comes to something like this, we don't have right now, very clear regulation. It's coming. So that's the good thing. There is thought, there is dialogue. But, I think the deeper question, like there are two challenges with, let's say, a lot of the startups that are doing the direct-to-user kind of chatbot model of therapy or whatever. One is that creating guardrails is very difficult. Even while there is this idea that we must create guardrails, the developers of AI technology themselves say that they don't understand how the technology works. So how do you tame something that you don't understand how it works? But even if, let's say, you really circumscribe and build like very strong guardrails around this, there is the deeper question that Anshul had alluded to, which is what does this kind of emotional dependency look like? Do you develop social emotional regulation as a young person by talking to a very flattering, on-demand chatbot, or is the process of development friction? I mean, is that really important and vital? And so how are we building up societies to engage in human friction and build themselves up versus sort of taking the kind of friction-free chatbot? So it is complicated. And I think with the for-profits, because the incentives are always something one has to kind of understand a lot more deeply, that is where I think to some extent policy and regulation has to enter the space as well.
Anshul, would you want to answer that? Because in a certain part of the country, the dependence would be a certain way. In a certain other segment in the country, the dependence would be in a certain way. Would you then say that these mental wellness, AI-driven mental wellness startups are problem enablers or escalating that problem to a certain level?
I mean, I wouldn't want to put a label to them. It's of course a tricky terrain because, like you rightly said, AI is not going to go anywhere. People are going to create, more of these startups, and I don't entirely know if it's going to be a massive problem for us going ahead, but I do know for sure what Natasha said is completely true, which is that we do need guardrails, and they do probably need to come in the form of policy regulations, because just how we are seeing recently, there was of course a very there was a big backlash, but we had a gaming regulation that just came about a couple of days ago. There was a discussion on that. Similarly, I feel like the government and various other institutions are definitely very aware of the fact that there are burdens that this kind of technology will put on young people, and there need to be regulations that make sure that we are safeguarding young people. So I think one is that for sure. The other is the cultural sensitivity part that Natasha talked about, which is that at the end of the day, a lot of these models are being trained on what's publicly available. The data publicly available has biases. It already has certain kind of issues when it comes to identities, when it comes to caste, gender, various other issues, right? So we also need to take into account what are these models really training themselves on. And lastly, I feel like and this is a big debate, should users demand for better technology, or should technology creators create better technology, right? This is a very big debate, but unfortunately we've seen this time and again in the case of large tech companies. at the end of the day, they may not really care as much about what users are demanding. They will only care about what really works from the point of view of users spending more and more and more time. And having conformist chatbots that make you feel better over and over and over again is a sure shot way of getting people to spend more time, on those platforms. So I think it's a blend of higher cultural sensitivity, proper regulations, and of course making sure that even institutions, educational institutions are playing a very big role in informing children a lot better about how these technologies can have an impact without necessarily putting a ban on them. Because the moment that happens, we know for sure that it's going to go out of hand. So I think it's a slightly more nuanced response we need to have towards this trend that we are seeing.
Anshul and Natasha, thank you. This has been a thoroughly deep, a complex discussion that I think we think at least brought a lot of nuance to this topic. We hope everyone watching thought the same. Thank you for joining us here on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Okay, let's head into a break now. All right, after the break, wild swimming pools built with stream water, a biosphere bringing nature into our backyard, swimming without chlorine, pure water. We take a look on the other side of just how.
This is News 18 Network. India's largest news network.
Right now, is there a potential for a deal to change that number?
Look, it's real easy. India can get 25% off tomorrow if it stops buying Russian oil and helping to feed the war machine.
Not sending that signal.
They're not. And look, here's the thing. I'm puzzled, okay? Because Modi's a great leader. These people this is a mature democracy with intelligent people running it. And they look us bald-faced in the eye on the tariff part and say, we don't have the highest tariffs in the world, when in fact they do. There's no dispute about that if you look at the numbers. And then they say, we're not going to stop buying Russian oil. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we've talked about this, but it's worth talking to your viewers again. When India buys Russian oil at a discount, and then Indian refiners in partnership in India with Russian refiners make that and sell it at a premium to the rest of the world, right? Russia uses the money it gets to fund its war machine, kill more Ukrainians. And then the next thing that happens, of course, is Ukraine comes to us and Europe and says, give us some more money. So everybody in America loses because of what India is doing. The consumers and businesses and everything lose, and workers lose because India's high tariffs cost us jobs and factories and income and higher wages. And then the taxpayers lose because we got to fund Modi's war, okay? The road to peace runs at least partly right through New Delhi.
War?
I mean Modi's war.
Let me ask
because the road to peace runs in part through New Delhi.
Now, going back to my colleague Siddhant, Siddhant, it seems to be confusion there. We just heard Peter Navarro's statement there. Earlier, of course, we were listening to the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying something else. He was saying that, India and US will come together eventually. He was showing that optimism in that. And now you have Peter Navarro going completely opposite to it, calling it Modi's war.
Well, that's right. So as we were discussing before, Arun, that they are frustrated because they couldn't stop the war. There have been a lot of efforts given by President Trump to bring President Putin to the tables and, to get a ceasefire or to get the war stopped, but he couldn't. So now what they're doing is, and also they're not liking the fact that India is withstanding its ground. India is not stuck up to the demands of the administration by opening the markets for the agri and dairy products. Perhaps that's what they have been asking for. So, it's kind of a double frustration one, they couldn't stop the war in Ukraine, and the second, they couldn't get from India what they were expecting. And in fact, as you rightly said, yesterday Scott Bessent also said that India came early. We were expecting deal with India by May or June, but it couldn't happen. But Scott Bessent was measured what he said yesterday, and in fact, he said that India is largest democracy. We are the largest economy. Perhaps one day we will come together. So but what Peter Navarro has said, perhaps calling it a Modi for, I expect that there's going to be a very sharp reaction coming from New Delhi on this statement of Peter Navarro calling Ukraine conflict and Modi's war, because the fact is that China is still buying Russian crude. Europe has been buying Russian crude and energy from last 3 years. Since last December, there was an agreement, and the gas was being supplied, and it was Russia that was paying Ukraine to use the gas pipeline. The United States itself has been importing a lot of things from Russia. Then why only targeting India being targeted? Why only going after India? Perhaps this is something which, in fact, everybody is asking, Arun, at this point in time. In fact, the House Foreign Affairs Committee also came up with a statement, and it says that instead of imposing sanctions on China or others purchasing large amount of Russian oil, Trump's singling out India with tariffs, hurting Americans and sabotaging the U.S.-India relationship in the process. So as I said, there's double frustration. One, they couldn't get a deal with India because India has not come to their demand. And the second, they couldn't stop the war in Ukraine.
Welcome back. Our person of interest this morning, Vikas Kumar, he left his job as a chartered accountant to follow an unusual idea, building natural swimming pools.
Now, through his company, Biosphere, he designs pools that use stream water, plants and stones instead of chemicals and chlorine. It's a shift towards sustainable living, and his work is slowly bringing wild natural water experiences to homes across India. We thought we had to bring him onto the show. Let's go over to him to understand a little bit more. Hello, it's so lovely to have you here on the show this morning. Sir, tell us, what made you leave a stable CA job and say that this is something I need to do for other people too? We know you did it for yourself first. Tell us about that. But then also, why make this bigger? What was the thought there?
It was never planned. The demand just came in with family and friends and their friends, and people who see it when they come and use it. They want it more. We started as a hobby, first for myself, then as a hobby on the weekends for people who wanted it. And there was so much of demand that I had to take a call whether to continue the building pools or my CA. I had to choose one. And this was a fun and more challenging than practicing CA. Being an outdoors guy who likes to trek and travel and paraglide and other outdoor activities, this seemed to be a better fit to me. And it's fun to meet similar kind of people who enjoy the outdoors and who want to make a change. And water, I think any kind of even the smallest water feature makes a big difference in our home. That's a subtle sound of the water moving is like meditation, at least to me.
It all began with a thought that you wanted to do this for your son, and it's become a way of life for you. But tell us a little bit about the technicalities involved here. How were you able to crack it all? How exactly does a bio pool work? Because we do know traditionally they use a lot of chlorine for these swimming pools, and that's what keeps the water clean. How do you do that here?
Biopool is what we call a living ecosystem. So we are trying to replicate the ecosystem how it's in the wild, where no human intervention is being present. So bacteria and plants absorb the nutrients, thereby not having any more nutrients left for the algae. So we are not actually killing the algae, but you're preventing them by not coming into the system. Whereas in a chlorinated pool, basically you're killing the algae with the chlorine, but you're not preventing them from coming in. So this is it is like how nature intended. It's an ecosystem. It is a living organism by itself, which matures over time, which gets clearer over time, and it's where every organism is going to be alive in. And then you get the feel of like swimming in a crystal clear Himalayan stream, but this is what you get in your backyard, and you enjoy it 365 days whenever you want.
I loved earlier when you said that the sound sounds a little meditative for you. You love having the sound of the stream in your own biopool. Tell us a little bit about basic questions. What is the cost if one wanted to try doing this themselves? So they didn't want to involve you the same way you did it the first time. What are the costs? How should someone go about it? And then tell us a little bit about how much does setup cost with a company like yours, for example.
So this one our kit in India is not available. So I had to go around, literally importing things and trying to figure out what works, and so I had to create the whole ecosystem of supply to get it done. For an example, the pumps we use are high output water pumps with very low power consumption, because I want to run these pumps 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So these should be zero noise, at the same time shouldn't fail, and should be friendly on the pocket. So currently we don't have this kind of a technology in India, pumps which supply. So we have very low quality pumps coming in from China, which are normally used in the koi ponds kind. But since this being a bioswimming pond where humans are going to use it, I was not too comfortable using a system which is not secure, or the electrical being in the water kind of a scenario. So I went through a lot of trials and errors, to figure out the equipments needed, the machines needed, then tying up with the right companies to develop that product for us to use. So currently, I think as a DIY is a very tough challenge, but it's not something impossible. So it is going to be more pricey when you compare to your chemical swimming pool, where you have enough vendors across the country who are willing to come and install it for you guys. So in a bioswim pond, I would say it's a pure customized design and setup where there's so much of customization possible. The shapes are unlimited. So every swim pond is different. Like there might be 4 swim ponds in your locality, and all the 4 are going to look different. So if I have to say a price point, I'll say it starts from around 4,500 rupees a square feet when we come and install it for you guys, with all the equipment and all the setup included.
Okay.
Because price is one, but thought is the other aspect to it. Do you think it was challenging or remains challenging to convince people that, this is what you should opt for, this is where safety lies, don't opt for a conventional swimming pool? Because a lot of people go into constructing their home design or home space with a mindset that, this is luxury, this is what luxury looks like. Have you had to battle that thought when you're making this pitch to people?
It is very much going to happen throughout, I guess, because it's something totally not something what they're used to. So we do something called a bioswim pool, where it looks like your conventional pool, but the filtration alone is the biological system which we do. So a pond is going to be a much more tougher sell to most people, because the sight of rocks and pebbles and the plants, they're just scared. But luckily, since I have my own swim pond, and a lot of people fly down from different parts of India to come and experience it. Once they experience it, there's no turning back. It's just that getting the people into the ponds or the swimming pools, first time is the tougher challenge. And luckily, there's very good demand for it, and we are able to keep my team busy.
What are the trickiest parts when it comes to maintenance? Tell us a little bit about that. So if you have a biopool in your backyard, I know the tagline is sort of that there's not much you need to do, but is that actually the truth? There has to be something.
There is maintenance. It's not zero maintenance.
Okay.
But then in a swim pond, let's say you're looking at a maintenance of a couple of hours once in 3 months. So that's why I say it's as low maintenance as possible. So as long as that filter pump is running and the bacteria and plants are kept alive automatically, you're not going to feed it with any nutrients into it. So as long as that cycle is running 24 hours a day, or majority of the day, power cuts are fine, but then running majority of the day, it maintains itself. And what I say that small little bit of maintenance is like gardening, removing dead leaves and trimming off some plants and scrubbing off a little bit of rocks for you to walk on. That's kind of a bare minimum maintenance which any unskilled labor on your property will be able to do. You don't need any skilled labor coming from my team or from any other part to do. That's why we say it's maintenance free.
Vikas, you must tell us about the initial journey, life as a CA on a professional front. How did you decide to leave it for this full time, and what was that duration like from when you first started attempting it to finally achieving success and turning it into a lifetime project?
See, I started experimenting with this pre-COVID. A couple of years even before COVID is when we started experimenting with it. And I think my first successful pool of my personal one, what got completed during the second lockdown in COVID. So because the lockdowns in COVID were spent in the farmhouse for me. So we had enough time in hand and the laborers were available and we can't go out, right? So we had enough time to experiment and talk to experts internationally online. Because even they are at home, they had the time to allot to me to consult with me and things like that. So it just happened. These two lockdowns helped me push the technology to fit into the Indian climates. And yeah, the moving into business was much more longer. But I'll say from 24 is when we are moved into it full time. So when demand rise and I just couldn't keep up with completing the projects by only visiting the sites on Saturdays and Sundays where my presence was needed throughout the week. That's when I took a call that okay, let's focus on this full time, and it's been hectic. We normally work 7 days a week. That's how our schedule is going.
Very cool to hear. Okay, tell us lastly, I know that with things like dengue and malaria and essentially waterborne, diseases, the fear is essentially that still water is what you're told to look out for. But I do want to ask, do people, and this is not still water, obviously, it's moving water. You've created a stream and then a pool. But I do want to ask, do people come to you and ask you questions about insects, about fungi, for example, that could be harmful, bacteria getting collected in certain areas, and what are the real fears there? Have you had any disasters that you've had to firefight?
Currently, as of now, luckily, no. But I think the first question people ask me is, what about snakes?
Snakes.
When to come into the water, this is a living water, so snakes do come in. So what do we do about it and how do we prevent that? So I tell them it is a living system. So any organisms or any living creatures will come towards it. But the way we prevent them is, the planting zone or the filter zone, what we call them, is kept quite further away from the swimming zone. And that is more like a safe space for them with hiding spots and insects and everything available as food source for them. Whereas swim zones, it's a highly water moving area where we swim. So assume if it's a 30,000 liter water body swim zone we are moving the same 30,000 out of your swim zone into the filter zone pretty much in 1 hour. That's a kind of high flow we are having inside it, which also prevents the mosquitoes or your frogs from laying eggs. It's not comfortable for them to come in. And so this prevents it. And to be double sure that in Indian climate, like you said, bacteria and fungal issues shouldn't come in, we have a UV setup also fitted into it. So before it enters the plant zone for filtration, it goes through a UV cycle.
Yeah, okay.
So anything is not taken care.
What's interesting, Vikash, in all your
multiple other
designs is
systems
that
are
these
also to add to make sure that
these are so very different. Each of these designs are so different. The concept is brilliant and chemical free. So that really does the magic it creates. Thank you so much, Vikash, for that lovely idea and for that lovely conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, let's move on from those beautiful visuals of biopools that we were taking a look at to something else entirely. We take you to discover if the 2025 Volvo, we're taking you onto the roads now. This is the Volvo EX30. We want to understand if it lives up to its promise as a compact luxury EV.
And we decided to put this stylish and tech-packed vehicle through its paces to see if it's the perfect entry point into electric luxury. Does it really meet the expectations though? Here's the overdrive verdict.
Now it's been a while since we've seen a small practical Volvo in India, so this new EX30 comes at just the right time. It also happens to be the first truly born electric Volvo we've seen in the country, so it does things differently and quite interestingly. But is it really the one for you? Let's find out. It's difficult to fit the Volvo EX30 into a particular segment or body type. It's about as large as any of these entry-level luxury cars, but can't quite be called a hatch and isn't SUV enough to be termed a crossover. But that also means that it's distinct, especially since it carries Volvo's newest design theme. The light design stands out the most on a fairly blank face, and the cooling vents have been smartly integrated into the look. Now, as with most electric cars, you do get a frunk, although I must say that it's quite small at just 7 litres. Now, considering this is a born electric SUV, I was expecting it to be a bit more and a bit more useful than just being a place to put your chargers. But you get this neat sort of Easter egg with the reindeers and the Volvo kind of silhouettes, which is nice. So yeah, this is what the frunk of the EX30 is like. In profile, the Volvo EX30 does well to attract attention within its compact footprint. The large 19-inch wheels give it a big helping of presence, and despite its shape, ground clearance is a good 171 mm. The flat lines and surfaces give it that functional IKEA-like vibe that works. There's a bit of flair with the upturned glass area and coupe-like roof. Now, considering the size of the EX30, the boot isn't very big. It's 318 litres, but I must say that whatever is there is quite practical. So as you can see, the lip is pretty high and it's a squarish space, so you will fit a lot of stuff in it. A neat sort of Easter egg, if you will, or a smart touch by Volvo is this panel here, which tells you the exact measurements of the car and the kind of stuff that you might be able to fit inside. And just to make things a bit easier, you can also lower this floor a little bit to give you a bit more space. Now, with this being a rear-driven EV, like many others of its kind, you don't get a spare wheel. So that is something you will have to be a bit careful of when driving it in India. The rear is a smart angle for the EX30 with the split vertical tail lamps, adding a new take on the traditional Volvo layout. You have just the right degree of flash with the sloping windscreen and plastic trim, along with the large Volvo lettering. Now, one of the things you always notice with Volvos is that they do things a bit differently, but with this EX30, with it being a completely new sort of take on what a Volvo can be, being from a born electric platform, they've really taken things to a different level. And you notice this when you look at this cabin. It's very different from a lot of cars that you might find at this price point, and very different from, say, what the slightly larger C40 as it was known is like. So what you do get, first of all, is that typical kind of born electric kind of arrangement. So you will notice that the sill itself is quite low, and the dash has this very minimal modern design that you find in many Volvos and generally also in many new cars. But again, things are done a bit differently. This pattern that you see is not just a design, it's because Volvo has used recycled plastic material, and those specs you see actually in the trim, which I think is pretty neat. But that doesn't mean that quality has taken a beating, because most of the surfaces, this part here is soft. These vents function with quite a bit of heft, and same for the steering wheel. All the bits that you touch, even on the doors, everything is soft. As you may have noticed, the EX30 doesn't have a driver's instrument cluster. Instead, it's taken quite a minimal turn with the speed and ADAS graphics integrated into the vertical 12.3-inch screen, somewhat like a Tesla. This seems quite odd at first, but you do get used to it quicker than you expect. Although a head-up display would have made life easier. Again, similar to a Tesla, you adjust the door mirrors through the screen, which can get confusing sometimes. The screen is the same Android-based system you see in other Volvo cars, but updated to include more functions and with a more modern interface than, say, the XC90. It's quite responsive and intuitive, but you only get Apple CarPlay, so Android users will have to set up their profiles in the car to access all of their data. The climate menus have been made more usable, but the lack of buttons still can be a bit of a hassle on the move. Now, again, one of the things that's been done differently is this panel right here, which, as it suggests here, is actually a massive sound bar. So many of the 9 speakers of that Harman Kardon audio system are actually right in front of you, which again goes with that slightly more modern vibe. And just to drive home that point of this being a very practical car, you will notice this kind of arrangement in front of you. It's completely open, empty, and just gives you that kind of BEV feel, if you will. You have those two wireless chargers here. You have a cubby here, as you can see, with two more Type-C chargers. A lot of stuff fits in here. Now you might be wondering where the cup holders are, because they aren't around. So this is a great party trick if you're traveling with new friends and so on. It'll be a good touch. And if you don't want to carry cups, it becomes another different storage space. And if you're just traveling alone, then you can do this. So very thoughtfully done. The one thing that somehow doesn't quite work for me is the fact that you get just two window switches. To access the rear, you have to press this. As you can see, it's not very easy to press, so it kind of becomes a bit difficult to use on the move.
This is News 18 Network. India's largest news network.
Right now, is there a potential for a deal to change that number?
Look, it's real easy. India can get 25% off tomorrow if it stops buying Russian oil and helping to feed the war machine.
Not sending that signal.
They're not. And look, here's the thing. I'm puzzled, okay? Because Modi's a great leader. These people this is a mature democracy with intelligent people running it. And they look us bald-faced in the eye on the tariff part and say, we don't have the highest tariffs in the world, when in fact they do. There's no dispute about that if you look at the numbers. And then they say, oh, we're not going to stop buying Russian oil. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we've talked about this, but it's worth talking to your viewers again. When India buys Russian oil at a discount, and then Indian refiners, in partnership in India with Russian refiners, make that and sell it at a premium to the rest of the world, right? Russia uses the money it gets to fund its war machine, kill more Ukrainians. And then the next thing that happens, of course, is Ukraine comes to us and Europe and says, give us some more money. So everybody in America loses because of what India is doing. The consumers and businesses and everything lose, and workers lose because India's high tariffs cost us jobs and factories and income and higher wages. And then the taxpayers lose because we got to fund Modi's war, okay? The road to peace runs at least partly right through New Delhi.
War?
I mean Modi's war.
Let me ask
because the road to peace runs in part through New Delhi.
Now, going back to my colleague Siddhant, it seems to be confusion there. You know, we just heard Peter Navarro's statement there. Earlier, of course, we were listening to the US, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying something else. He was saying that, India and US will come together eventually. He was showing that optimism in that. And now you have Peter Navarro going completely opposite to it, calling it Modi's war.
Well, that's right. So we were discussing before, Arun, that they are frustrated because they couldn't stop the war. There have been a lot of efforts given by President Trump to bring President Putin to the tables and, to get a ceasefire or to get the war stopped, but he couldn't. So now what they're doing is, and also they're not liking the fact that India...
So you've seen the big arc lights here, the flashy cameras, but beyond all of this, journalism is all about hard work. So if you have it in you to make a name for yourself in this hyper-competitive industry, then let CNN News 18 be your platform.
This is News 18 Network. India's largest news network.
Right now, is there a potential for a deal to change that number?
Look, it's real easy. India can get 25% off tomorrow if it stops buying Russian oil and helping to feed the war machine.
Not sending that signal.
They're not. And look, here's the thing. I'm puzzled, okay? Because Modi's a great leader. These people this is a mature democracy with intelligent people running it. And they look us bald-faced in the eye on the tariff part and say, we don't have the highest tariffs in the world, when in fact they do. There's no dispute about that if you look at the numbers. And then they say, oh, we're not going to stop buying Russian oil. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we've talked about this, but it's worth talking to your viewers again. When India buys Russian oil at a discount, and then Indian refiners in partnership in India with Russian refiners make that and sell it at a premium to the rest of the world, right? Russia uses the money it gets to fund its war machine, kill more Ukrainians. And then the next thing that happens, of course, is Ukraine comes to us and Europe and says, give us some more money. So everybody in America loses because of what India is doing. The consumers and businesses and everything lose, and workers lose because India's